a lot of our work is focused on resilience. That's helping people to deal with adversity and the setbacks in life. But increasingly, we're beginning to focus on the positivity and the optimism side of the equation. That's the other half of mental toughness. Resilience is very useful as a means of survival, but it doesn't really help you to thrive and grow. And that's a challenge, not just a challenge for people in the prison service or in the prison system, it's a challenge for people everywhere. I guess you've already touched upon a lot of this, but perhaps we can explore this notion of optimism and hope a little bit more.
I'd love to, because I think that we've got a lot of people surviving, as you say, but not thriving. And that may be some of our choices about what we expose ourselves to all the time. News, for example, Doug.
Yeah.
The news, the bad news, versus some of the facts about life that we're not allowed to talk about, that there possibly is less poverty in the world than there was 20 years ago, that actually more people are surviving cancer. Do you know what I mean? When we're not, that there are some great medical breakthroughs that have changed things. There is some good news as well that we don't want to focus on as society.
No, you're absolutely right, Sarah. I mean, as you know, I'm the odd person out here. I'm not a psychologist. I'm a pretend psychologist. And my background and training was as an economist. And for a long time, all measures of, I don't know, happiness or contentment in the society have been correlated with the economic state of society. So if everybody thinks the economy is doing well, then everybody feels happy. If they think it's doomed, then everybody feels they're doomed. And one of the economists that I particularly liked was a guy called Milton Friedman. And he spoke about the theory of expectations. He was the person who switched me on to understand, exploring psychology. Friedman talked about inflation. He said inflation wasn't necessarily a natural phenomenon. Sometimes inflation would occur because we think prices were going to go up. So we go out and rush and buy stuff, and that would force the prices up. But it was our expectation that started it. It wasn't some sort of feature of the economic system. So I completely agree with you. If we sort of talk ourselves down, we'll make life miserable for everyone. And that must be a challenge for people who generally see little opportunity for themselves. And we're talking about people generally.
In this situation, talking about positivity and thriving, I think that there are certain basic things that can be helpful. One is, what you expose yourself to. So if you watch the news 3 or 4 times a day and it's really doom and gloom, then you tend to, there is some contagious effect about that. In the same way, if you hang out with very doom and gloomy people, that will also impact your mood and sense of well-being and happiness. So I think it's really important that people also have a sense of gratitude for their own life right now, if it's not disastrous. So sometimes people say to me, oh, everything's terrible. And I kind of will bring things back to them. I'll say, so tell me what's terrible for you. And they might struggle that, they might say, well, I'm fine. I've got, a house, or my pension's good enough, or I do fine. So they're allowing the external world to disproportionately impact their life situation right now, and possibly losing out on the gratitude and the joy of their situation right now. And I think that's kind of interesting, because that may be to do with all sorts of things that I can see. One is increased communication with everyone around us, perhaps through social media, seeing other people. For parents, adult parents with adult children, being overdrawn into their lives and their difficulties, potentially because of over communication in a way that wasn't always there 20 years ago. You know, that there wasn't so much communication all of the time.
Mm-hmm.
Feedback from others. I think there's also some confusion that if you love someone, you have to bear their pain. But that doesn't always lead to a happy life. You can love someone, be supportive of someone, but recognize your own, you know, blessings, for want of a better word, and from that position, perhaps be a better supporter to the other.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have to match a sense of mood. And I think, so I think there's huge, I've just touched on a couple of areas, but I think there's massive changes in society over the last 20 years that potentially might lead us into a few cul-de-sacs about feeling it's okay to enjoy our own good fortune, as well as being a supporter and compassionate to others. So that those are some first thoughts about thriving. Does society give us permission to thrive?
I find it really interesting, the kind of keeping coming back to this sense of like recognizing that the way I feel and my emotions. So when you were talking about, for example, people in prison, kind of letting go of the guilt, but not responsibility, because responsibility is more of a pragmatic thing, but the guilt that's attached with it, you can kind of let go of. And the reason we refer to kind of mental toughness, mental sensitivity, is that sensitivity is almost being sensitive to the context. And what I'm hearing there is you describe individuals, certainly from an emotional point of view, that are absorbing the emotions from the context that they're in, the environment they're in. And that would imagine the amount of personal resource that you would use if you're absorbing all the emotions from situations either immediate to you, local to you, or even with social media, I suppose, or the news, even internationally. So I suppose it kind of makes sense that you have that resilience, that toughness is about recognizing there's a barrier from an emotional point of view between outside of me, even if it's people that are very close to me, and things that are more internally generated. So that's really got me thinking.
And I think, you know, there's two kind of maladaptions of that. One is that kind of notion of Teflon coating, where you cannot therefore show empathy to others because, you know, it can't get across that membrane. I don't think that's helpful, because it stops communication and connection, and we know connection's good for us. But I think it's something about a kind of more a kind of osmosis with an extra layer, that you can be sensitive to others, you can read and sense emotions, but then you can also keep that contained space for yourself to recognize your own emotional space and landscape. And because if you want to help or support others, you need to be able to do that. And it's a bit of a fine art for parents, for family members, for friends, for professionals, for all sorts of people. And I think that, you know, the impact of social media, some of the messaging in life has not been helpful. Schools' responses, I think, you know, they haven't prepared people as well to do that. It's not just about monitoring yourself. It's about skills to hear others and the interface between the two. And there are key elements around around that make it safer for both parties and more enjoyable. You know, what kind of world do we live in when you can't just be proud and say, you know, life's going great? And we see less of that. People feel guilty at a time of cost of living crisis to say, you know what, I've got a roof over my head, I'm working, my kids are well, life's going great. And people don't want to say that anymore. So I think that doesn't mean that you're not empathizing with all those who are really, really struggling and perhaps struggling to pay their bills, but we should be able to acknowledge that actually we're okay and we're doing well. Because that gives everyone else hope. You know, that actually you know, that it's okay or it's enough. And that's good. So the enough versus good, etc.
I think that's another excellent point, Sarah. I like this idea of, well, we hear a lot about it, about feeling a sense of gratitude. In order to do that, though, you need to have some sort of degree of control or accountability, because you can't experience gratitude for somebody else's achievements. You've got to experience gratitude for your own. One of the things that we've been exploring over the last 4 or 5 years and getting a better handle on is, I think, something you've touched on. That's getting rid of typing. People get labeled. And even with our concept of mental toughness and mental sensitivity, people will often say, oh, you've got to be more mentally tough. Actually, when we dig deep, you can be mentally sensitive and perfectly successful. You can be mentally tough and a complete failure. You are who you are. Be happy with who you are. Learn when who you are works and when it doesn't. But you don't reject who you are because of a label. We label everybody.
Yeah, I mean, I can't think of a time in my world, in my life, where we're pathologizing any more than now. It's very rare for me to meet someone without some kind of label. So it's a neurodivergent label, or normally 6. It's a label strongly attributed around everything, absolutely everything. And as soon as we label, we reduce the agility to move.
Yes.
You know, so if we tell someone at school, well, you're below average, that immediately makes it harder for them to move, to develop. If we tell them they've got special education needs, and that means they won't become like someone else. If we tell them they're in poverty, that, you know, all these labels that we use, if we tell them they've got depression, then there is less room to move. The best one I had was working with a parent some years ago, and I went to see a mum and a son. The son was about 15, having lots of problems. And I said to the young person, the son, I said, well, you know, how's life for you? And he says, well, it's hard, you know, knowing I've had to deal with pain. And I said to the mum, oh, what pain has, you know, your son got? I kind of looked in my notes. I didn't have anything. And she said, well, when he was about 5, I took him to the GP, and the GP said, keep going with the Calpol. He was 15 and still on Calpol. So that well-meaning GP had never intended to give that mother a kind of life sentence of Calpoling her child. But he didn't say this is temporary. He didn't say this can stop. And when we're working with professionals and with power, anything they do or tell us to do tends to keep going for longer than it should do, whether it's medication for an anxiety or a depression, whether it's a label of that. And it tends to disappear, or could do, over time, as can a treatment requirement. So this young man had picked up that he was living with pain and he was still taking his Calpol. And that had left him hugely impacted. The rest is history. But that's an extreme response to also saying to someone, you're below average, and we meet them at 40 and they still have a sense they're below average. If you say to someone who comes to see you because their granny's died and they're anxious at that time, and you give them an antidepressant or an anti-anxiety med, and then 8 years later, they're still on that. And they're still saying, I've got anxiety and my condition is. And so we actually, within this diagnostic, pathologizing, labeling world, are limiting people's room to maneuver, to grow. And it's so worrying. I can't lie. It's so worrying.
And I suppose, well, one thing you see an awful lot of in the education sector then is, and health as well, really, is that supports get built around that labeling and pathologizing. So I would have had a few, students go on to be educational psychologists, for example, where because parents want their child to receive the supports that they think they need, and perhaps they do need support, they're coming in almost begging for a positive diagnosis. Like, what kind of world have we created where parents are taking their child to a professional wanting a positive diagnosis, because without it, the supports will be withheld? And it's not that that person necessarily needs a label. They need some support for something, or certainly for a period of time, they need some kind of support. But it's kind of when, I suppose, when the oversimplification of the mind meets the oversimplification of societal structures, with this is what we end up with.
Absolutely. And we've had that. We've had a lot of parents who say, if I can't get any joy from you, I'll go to someone else. Bringing children for mental health issues, and wanting us to report to school that they've got mental health issues. And I think the thing is, it's understanding what that's about. And it is in that period of time, either the parent or the child wants support right now, typically before exam time. So, we need to work out whose need it is. Perhaps the parent, perhaps they struggled at school and that's unresolved and they want their kid to do better than them. All kind of worthy, but, needs a little bit of support in itself. And so for me, it's really important to focus on the support need and the limit of it and the fact that it's only right now. Children grow. So we hope we grow throughout our lives. So why are we providing a kind of burden to somebody that limits in their minds what can be achieved? So I think everything should be for right now. This year you've struggled a bit with your reading. It's right now. And this is the support we're doing to address that. And then we can review and look at it later. So, these kind of lifelong labels for me are really not helpful. And we need to understand and get behind the support. We know when there's not enough of it in schools, people then start playing into, because of the requirements of the system to get the support, perhaps looking or competing with others for support and using a diagnostic or labeling route. And that's possibly because we haven't got enough support for in schools. And it's certainly not tailored enough for individual needs.
Absolutely.
Well, I think that's an hour. I think that's been a great conversation, Sarah. I don't know whether you've got anything else you want to add. I mean, you're a very thoughtful person, and you've obviously reflect a great deal on your work and the world in which you inhabit.
Yeah, I mean, I'm privileged enough, Doug, aren't I, to work with great professionals, have a variety of work in Atrium Clinic. And, you know, I've learned a lot, and we continue to learn. We're really interested in what you guys are doing. You know, we just want to be able to support the next generations. I would like to be bold, to thrive, not
Right.
to thrive. So I think you know, it's very complicated. It's not simplistic, but, you know, I just commend you both and all of you on your work, because it's really important.
Well, what I think you've described very, very well is the complexity of the world in which we live in, and why some people find it extraordinarily complicated to be able to lead a satisfactory life. And the reality is we can do our little bit. We can't change it all, because we keep coming back to there's a societal perspective to all of that. And that I think is beyond our control, and maybe is an example of the failure of politicians in recent years. Because I'm still old enough to remember Kennedy's inaugural speech when he said, "Think not of what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." And from my perspective, I think a bit of that has been lost. We expect things from government. We don't expect to give things back.
Good luck to you all. Keep the conversation going. It's really important.
Thank you again, Sarah.